Hello, welcome everybody to the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. I'm Mike Rugel. I run the museum's programs here. It's a pleasure to welcome Marc Leepson today. So we tell the stories of Jews in the American military, and probably the most significant pre-Civil War figure in that subject is Uriah Levy. He comes from a fascinating background, started in the War of 1812, and Marc will get into that. So I'd like to welcome Marc Leepson, who you can see is the author of many books, including on Lafayette, the American Flag, Francis Scott Key, is that as well? And Saving Monticello is the story of Uriah Levy and his family and their efforts to restore Thomas Jefferson's estate. So, Marc Leepson.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for coming. And by the way, we're streaming live on the World Wide Web, so questions will go out there for the entire world to hear. So I want to hear some good questions at the end. It's my pleasure to do a talk on this book, Saving Monticello. The book came out in '01, and it's still in print and paperback, no longer in print and hardcover, but I'm proud that it's still available and people are still interested, and it's a topic that I love talking about, and I want to thank you for coming. The book has several aspects to it. One is absolutely, it's a story of Jewish American history and military history. It's also a story of preservation, historic preservation, and it's a story of Virginia historic preservation. We're talking about Monticello here. And in Virginia, people have a special feel for history and preservation. And the way I like to illustrate that is to ask the question, how many Virginians does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is 3. 1 to change the bulb and 2 to discuss about how good the old one was. So this is a story of historic preservation at its heart. And the book starts on one of the most amazing days in American history, and that was the day that Thomas Jefferson died. And I think you know what day that was, don't you? July 4th, 1826. July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the founding of our nation. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, up on the mountain in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson died. And then about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, at his farm up in Massachusetts, John Adams died. Our second and third presidents died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the country that they founded. You know, people, when people found, they didn't have Twitter back then, so word didn't get out right away. But when they did find out, people reacted in apocalyptic terms. John Quincy Adams said it was a divine manifestation of the Lord's work. And it was a visible and palpable manifestation of divine manifestation. So what you should also know about July 4th, 1826 is that when Thomas Jefferson died, he was over $107,000 in debt. $107,000 in 1826. $107,000 is a nice piece of change in 2015, but back in 1826, it was a small fortune. And I didn't put it in the book, but people kept asking me after the book came out, how much would $107,000 be in current money? So I thought, well, how would I do that? So I went on the internet. And actually, there's some websites where you plug in a number and a date and a year, and it'll give you an approximate. It has to be an approximation because, you know, we didn't have the official consumer price index. But we figure it was about $1.5 million, maybe $2 million. So here the family is stuck with $1.5 million debt. And who is the family? So who inherited was Thomas Jefferson's oldest daughter, Martha Randolph. And the executor of the estate was her son, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, who they called Jeff, who was Thomas Jefferson's favorite grandson. They didn't know what to do. The Randolphs, they were the Randolphs of Virginia, and they were at this time kind of what you call land rich and cash poor. They didn't have any money. And so they decided that they would have to start selling things. So, you know, Jefferson owned 5,000 acres of land. They put the land up for sale. Land prices were low. They couldn't get hardly anything for it. And then in 1827, the year after Jefferson died, they had an auction up on the mountain, and they auctioned off, to use the technical term, all of his stuff, right? All of his furniture and furnishings. And we don't have complete records on that, but we do know that it didn't put much of a dent in the debt, and so they decided to put Monticello on the market. And, you know, Monticello was not in very good shape at that point. And and it took 4 years before it sold. And it sold in 1831 to a man named James Turner Barkley, who I have a picture of in the book. This is Barkley right here. We don't have time to talk about Barkley right now, but Barkley owned it for a couple of years. He couldn't make it work. He had some strange ideas. He wanted to grow silkworms up there at Monticello, and so he didn't do good things to Thomas Jefferson's trees. You know, Jefferson had the grove of trees that he planted like a garden. We think that that Barkley cut a lot down, and he couldn't make it very well. And he lived up there for a couple of years, and then he decided to sell the place. So Barkley bought it for $7,000, and he sold it in 1834 to a most unlikely buyer, and that was Uriah Phillips Levy, who was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, and he bought it for $2,700. Yeah. Oh, by the way, and it was down to 219 acres. Barkley sold off lots of acreage. So there was a fight over, there were two lawsuits over what conveyed, and it held the sale up for 2 years. But Levy did purchase it on April 4th, 1834, and he took possession in 1836. And when he took over, a visitor wrote that all was in dilapidation and ruin. All was in dilapidation and ruin at Monticello. Now, how did that happen? Well, you know, it goes back to Thomas Jefferson's financial condition. You know, even though, and it goes back to Jefferson's financial condition, to his spending habits, and to his ideas as an architect. You know, Jefferson was a self-taught architect, but, you know, he was a pretty darn good one, but he had some quirky ideas. He designed four, I want to use the technical term again, things, because they're not all buildings, right? What were the four things that he designed? He designed Monticello, his country place called Poplar Forest. You may know about Poplar Forest down near Lynchburg. It looks like a little Monticello. He also designed the Virginia State Capitol, and the University of Virginia. So you know Jefferson's ideas of architecture. Well, the residence, you know, Monticello may have been the first architecturally designed residence in the United States. If it wasn't the first, it was one of the first. And Jefferson had these interesting ideas. We know it was the first to have a dome on it. He built it up on that mountain, which was unheard of back in those days. Those houses and those plantations were all built along flat land, mostly along rivers, because of commerce sake. And it was not easy to get up that mountain. And as far as Monticello itself, the house, well, think about it. It has no front entrance. It's called the east and the west entrances. And then when you do walk in, where's the grand stair? Everybody been to Monticello? When you walk in, there's no grand staircase. There's two, if you look, there's two skinny little staircases that go up. That didn't go over well. He didn't really believe in bedrooms. Remember, Jefferson didn't have a bedroom. He had a bed, right? And that little alcove between downstairs between the study and the library and his office. So this was kind of a strange place. And it kind of became a white elephant. And it was in dilapidation and ruin. And it got that way because of Jefferson's financial condition. Number one, you know, when he retired from the presidency in 1809 and went to live at Monticello full time, he had pre-Revolutionary War debts of about $25,000. And he thought that he could pay off those debts with his farming and business ventures. Now, I don't have to tell you about Thomas Jefferson's accomplishments as a human being. I mean, you know, think of a field of endeavor, and Jefferson, you know, was amazing at it. He spoke 7 languages. He had a the largest private library in the country. He knew about astronomy, agronomy. Oh, by the way, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was vice president, president, secretary of state, minister to France. He was a great architect, et cetera, et cetera. However, Jefferson was a terrible businessman. He just had, what's the opposite of the Midas touch? He had the ungreen thumb. Everything he did, it just didn't work. And instead of his paying off those debts, the debts just increased. And it didn't, like the crops would be good one year, the prices would be down. Crops would be bad, the prices would be up. He owned 2 mills on the river down there. They leaked money. He bought Natural Bridge you all know Natural Bridge down there in Virginia. He bought it from the King of England, thinking he could make it into a tourist attraction. Never made a dime. He underwrote a note for one of his granddaughter's husband's father. It was a granddaughter's father-in-law for $20,000. The man died. Jefferson's debts doubled, and it just went on and on and on like that. And he owned slaves, right? We all know this. He owned over 200 slaves, and he didn't pay them, of course, but he had to feed them, he had to house them, he had to clothe them. And so he owed money to all the merchants in Charlottesville. So one of the consequences of that was that we had what we call in the 21st century delayed maintenance, right? He just didn't keep the place up. The other problem was that his daughter Martha, remember I talked about Martha who inherited, she lived up there with her 12 children. Because Jefferson's wife name was also Martha. She had died, and his daughter Martha came up there to run the household. Also because her husband was not a good man, and he kind of left the family. So there was Martha and the children. Then people loved to come to visit Monticello, bidden and unbidden. So there'd be relatives who would come. So cousins, aunts, nephews, nieces, and they would come with their servants and their slaves and their horses. And it wasn't uncommon for there to be 30 or 40 people staying up there for weeks, if not months at a time. So without the money to keep it up, the place just became a wreck. So and James Turner Barkley didn't do much good to it. So when Levy took it over, all was in dilapidation and ruin. This is Uriah Levy right here. And I will tell you a little bit about him because he is a really fascinating character. And he comes from one of the most distinguished and accomplished Jewish American families. He was born in Philadelphia in 1792, and he was fifth-generation American. Born in 1792, fifth-generation American. His great-great-grandfather came over here in 1733 with a group of Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition from Portugal. They went to London, and then they got on a ship, and they arrived in Savannah, Georgia in June of 1733. That was just a couple of months after the colony of Georgia was founded. And those 40 Jews, were among the founders of the city of Savannah, Georgia. And a few years later, they started a synagogue called Mikveh Israel, and Mikveh Israel is still there today in Savannah. I mean, it's not in the same building, but that congregation is the third oldest Jewish congregation in the country. Now Uriah Levy's great-grandfather, his name was Dr. Samuel Noonish, N-U-N-E-Z. He was a physician. He was court physician to the King of Portugal, and that's how they got out of Portugal. They were conversos, they were crypto Jews. They couldn't practice their religion overtly because if they did, they would be killed. So they were practicing secretly. There were spies in the house. And so the story goes, this is a great story, and I surely hope it's true because it keeps getting repeated, but how they escaped was that a British sea captain came to Lisbon, visited the house, and after dinner, he invited everybody in the household to come on the ship because he wanted to give them a tour of the ship, and then he took off for London. And the women had the family jewel sewed in their petticoats and so on. So I hope it's a true story. There's no real concrete evidence, but it keeps getting repeated. So something like that probably happened. Anyway, but we do know for sure they landed. Dr. Noonish was the only physician in the colony of Georgia for many years. He helped stem an epidemic, probably smallpox. He was honored by Governor Oglethorpe. That document is in the records. And for generations, the Noonish family was very prominent in Savannah. Now, the Uriah Levy's other sort of prominent forebearer was his grandfather, Jonas Phillips. Jonas Phillips, who came over here from Germany in the 1750s, wound up in Philadelphia, and he was a merchant and a successful merchant. And then he got caught up in the Revolutionary War fervor, joined a militia unit in Philadelphia, fought against the Brits in the Revolution, and he had 13 grandchildren. Uriah was his favorite, and he inculcated patriotism among his young grandchild, Uriah Phillips Levy, Jonas Phillips' grandson. The story is that Uriah Levy idolized two people growing up, George Washington and John Paul Jones. So when he was 10 years old, he ran away from home and he became a cabin boy on a ship. Came home at 13, which leads to the stories that he came home for his bar mitzvah, but it's another one that's just too good to be true. There's no real good evidence, but it's kind of fun saying it. But we do know that at 19, he was the part owner of a merchant ship. And then when he was 20 years old in 1812, he joined the U.S. Navy, and he became a hero of the War of 1812. He was assistant sailing master on a ship called the Argus. And the Argus's job was to intercept British ships in the Channel, in the English Channel. And the Argus was the most successful ship in the Navy doing that. They sunk, I think it was 24 or 25 British ships. And when they went to sink the next one, the Argus got captured. The captain was killed, and the entire crew was held prisoner in England for the rest of the war, including Uriah Levy. Well, after the war, he came home. He went on to have a 50-year career in the U.S. Navy. He was the first Jewish American to have a full Navy career. And when he died in service in 1862. And when he died, he was a Commodore, which was the highest rank in the U.S. Navy. Then, they didn't have Admiral then. Commodore was higher. And so he has the distinction of being the first Jewish Commodore as well. And I think you probably know that the first Jewish chapel on any American military facility was built in Norfolk at the big naval base down there, and that's the Uriah Levy Chapel, Jewish chapel. And then, the Naval Academy never had a Jewish chapel until, I think it was 2005. And they built it, and you know what it's called, the Uriah P. Levy Jewish Center and Chapel. Even though he never had any formal education, but the Naval Academy chose a Jewish hero to name that building after. And it's great. If you go to the Naval, you have to go there. It's really amazing. It's in a really beautiful spot right overlooking the river, right next to Bancroft. It's attached to Bancroft Hall, which is the main building on the Naval Academy. It's where they all live and eat, right? Okay, so there was also a destroyer escort named after Uriah Levy in World War II. I did a talk early on when the book came out, and a gentleman came up to me after, and he said he served on the USS Uriah P. Levy, and they always wondered who that guy was. And I said, well, I'm happy to tell you. And so he has his place in naval history for his role in the War of 1812, but also for a couple of other reasons. One of which was he was primarily, there are other people involved, but he had a very important role in the abolishment of flogging in the U.S. Navy, which was something that was done. And ironically enough, he also was court-martialed 6 times and thrown out of the Navy twice and reinstated by 2 different presidents. And mostly the courts-martial were kind of, basically, somebody would call him a dirty Jew, and he'd punch him right in the face. And it was kind of like in the NFL, like the original guy who does it doesn't get the penalty, but the guy who retaliates does. And so Levy was court-martialed, but he persevered, and he prevailed, and he went on to have this 50-year career. He also killed a man in a duel. It was off ship in Philadelphia. They were at a dance. A man called him a damn Jew. Levy slapped him in the face with his glove. They got on a rowboat. They rowed over the river to Camden, New Jersey. They paced it off. The guy fired first and he missed, and then Levy fired into the ground. Well, the guy reloaded, missed again. Levy fired into the ground. It happened a third time, and then Levy just shot him right through the heart. So this was a guy you didn't mess with. You know, you had to be to survive in the Navy at that time. And he was criminally tried and found not guilty. So that's our friend Uriah Levy. He died in 1862. He did not take part in the Civil War, although he wanted to. Actually, believe it or not, you know what his job was during the Civil War? He was the head of the court-martial board in Washington. I guess they figured he had a lot of experience. So, well, you know, he married late in life, and he never had any children. And he left a will that everybody who's read it has no idea what was going on in his brain when he wrote it, because he left Monticello to the people of the United States to be used as an agricultural school for the orphans of Navy warrant officers. We don't know if there were any orphans of Navy warrant officers in 1862. So the family was not happy about that will. You know, he had a wife, he had lots of brothers and sisters, he had, I think, there lots of nieces and nephews. They were all named in the will. There were 64 people who sued his estate, and it took, like, they were called partition lawsuits, like in a divorce over where the property would go. And so it took 17 years before those suits wound their way through the courts, because, you know, even though he owned Monticello, did I mention that he repaired, preserved, and restored Monticello? I don't think I did. Oh, by the way, you know, after he took over, you know, he hired an army of workers. He also owned slaves, and I also didn't tell you that he was a man of means. I forgot to tell you that. In the 1820s, he lived in New York City, and you know, when he wasn't on a ship, and when he wasn't at Monticello. And when in the 1820s, he bought up some real estate in Manhattan, and he bought, I think it was 9 rooming houses in a section of Manhattan that was a farming village. Well, the village's streets got paved and artisans started moving there, and at Greenwich Village. So he owned 9 rooming houses, made a lot of money. He was a man of means. That's why he was able to purchase Monticello and hire a small army of workers, and he owned slaves, and he repaired, preserved, and restored Monticello. Now, this was 1836. You know, when we think of the house preservation movement in America, we think of Anne Pamela Cunningham, who purchased Mount Vernon from John Augustine Washington, Jr., who was about to sell it up into estates. And she formed the Ladies Association of Mount Vernon, which still runs Mount Vernon to this day, and saved it. Well, that was 1854. So Uriah Levy in 1834 did a very similar thing at Monticello. Now, the words preservation and restoration were not in the language then. And people have made an argument, well, he bought a house and he fixed it up. But nevertheless, he was an admirer of Thomas Jefferson, and it was his thought to bring that thing to repair. So, and he did. He repaired it, preserved it, and restored it. So those lawsuits took 17 years to wend their way through the courts of Virginia and New York. Remember, his permanent residence was New York. And they wound up going to the Supreme Courts in both Virginia and New York. One of the reasons was, you know, they had circuit judges. So the judge would come, you know, twice a year to Charlottesville and hear some cases and then leave and not be back for 6 months. So during the lawsuit, Monticello was under the care of a caretaker who did not take very good care of it. His name was Joel Wheeler, and I will tell you 3 things that Joel Wheeler did that weren't in Monticello's best interests. First, he stabled cattle in the basement during the winter. Second, he stored and milled grain on those beautiful parquet floors inside. And third, and worst of all, he allowed University of Virginia students to have parties there. So, you know the reputation of University of Virginia students, right? When I tell that in Virginia, the audience just collapses in laughter. So, because the students had the reputation, but he also let other people have parties there, and they wrecked the place. There was a tradition of taking chippings out of the plaster, which they did, Jefferson's grave had so many chippings taken out of it, it was almost unrecognizable. There was a tradition of people scrawling their names inside the dome of Monticello. They counted over 1,000 names in there eventually. Not to mention everything else that was going on. Again, dilapidation and ruin. The terraces were rotted away, the roof was caving in, the windows were broken, the shutters were hanging down, the grove was gone, the grove of trees that Jefferson planted like a garden. The kitchen garden, you've been to Monticello, you've seen that 1,000-foot long kitchen garden that looks so beautiful now. That was completely gone. The only reason we have it today is because Jefferson kept such good records that they were able to reproduce it pretty much the way he had it. So the lawsuits were ended when when Uriah Levy's nephew bought out the other heirs for $10,500 and took over Monticello in 1879. And his name was Jefferson Levy. That's a picture of Jefferson Levy. He was named after Thomas Jefferson. His father was one of Uriah Levy's brothers, Jonas Levy. He was kind of a character. Jonas Levy named two of his children Louis Napoleon Levy and Jefferson Monroe Levy. So Jefferson Monroe Levy did what his uncle did. He kicked out Joel Wheeler, the bad overseer. He brought in a new superintendent, and he did, again, repaired, restored, and preserved Monticello. And you can see pictures. There's pictures in the book. You know, he bought it in 1879. We have pictures from the 1890s, and you can see that the stark difference. This picture on the cover is the oldest known photo of Monticello from about 1870, and it still had a ways to go. It looks terrible. And now Jefferson Levy, so again, emulates his uncle and repairs, preserves, and restores Monticello. And, you know, Jefferson Levy was an interesting man. If you read about him before this book, you would have read that he was a lawyer and a 3-term member of Congress from New York, which he was. But he was, what I found out during the research for this book was that he was a hugely successful real estate and stock speculator, to the point where he was a millionaire, 125 years ago when there were just a couple of thousand millionaires in the country. And he was a member of Congress in New York. He was a big lawyer. He bought and sold property everywhere he went, including Charlottesville. If you go down to Charlottesville, there's a building called the Levy Opera House. It's right on High Street. Guess who owned that for a time? Jefferson Levy. So he kicked out Wheeler. He brought in his own superintendent, a man named Thomas Rhodes. And Rhodes wound up living up there for 50 years. And with Jefferson Levy's money and Thomas Rhodes' industriousness on site, he brought Monticello back. Now, what do they say? No good deed goes unpunished. Well, in 1909, a national movement grew up to take Monticello from Jefferson Levy and turn it into a government-run shrine to Thomas Jefferson. It was led by a woman named Maud Littleton, and Mrs. Littleton had the time and the money and the motivation, and she got a national campaign going. Her husband was Thomas Wiley Littleton, who was a big lawyer in New York and a member of Congress, a fellow Democrat with Jefferson Levy. They knew each other. And in 1909, Mrs. Littleton and Congressman Littleton were in Charlottesville, and Jefferson Levy, who lived in New York but often came to Monticello, invited them up to the mountain, which he often did. They had dinner there, and later Mrs. Littleton wrote that she was appalled by what she saw there. She saw no evidence of Thomas Jefferson, and that Jefferson Levy was turning this into a shrine to his uncle. And yes, there was a portrait of Uriah Levy in his Navy uniform. There was models of his ships, but there was nothing like that. Anyway, Mrs. Littleton gets this national campaign going, and there are hearings. A bill is introduced in Congress in 1912 that would have taken Monticello, condemned the place, taken it, and turned it into a government-run shrine to Jefferson. And there were hearings in the spring and summer of 1912 in which Mrs. Littleton and her forces and Jefferson Levy and his forces battled it out over what would become of Monticello. Jefferson Levy hired Judge Duke, Thomas Duke of Charlottesville, whose grandfather was Jefferson's lawyer. And he was a high-powered lawyer. And by the way, Jefferson Levy was, like his uncle, a pretty pugnacious guy. He said, if once the White House is for sale, I'll sell Monticello. So these hearings were very bombastic. They made the front pages of the newspapers. Somebody called it the War of 1912. And the War of 1912 ended in December of 1912 when a bill came to the floor of the House of Representatives that would have condemned Monticello, turned it into this government-run shrine to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson Levy was a congressman, so was Martin Littleton. Littleton did not vote on that. He abstained, but Levy voted against it. And guess what? It was voted down. It was voted down on, what the main argument was what we call property rights argument now. The government had never tried to take any individual's property and much less turn it into a shrine to one of our founding fathers. So the war was over, but the battle was over, but the war did not end because that bill was reintroduced in Congress in 1913. And they had more hearings in 1913, 14, 15, 16, even into 1917. Now, in October of 1914, Jefferson Levy announced that he said, okay, enough is enough. I will sell the place. Now, by the way, both Uriah Levy and Jefferson Levy bought back acreage. So now we have about 650 acres. Now, remember when they had the auction, all of Thomas Jefferson's furniture and furnishings went to the Four Winds. When Jefferson Levy took over, he announced that he was going to try to reacquire. Well, he only reacquired a couple of pieces, a table, a chair here or there. But he furnished that place with antiques and period pieces. And he was going to give all of that, all the furniture and furnishings, Monticello, 650 acres, and his asking price was $500,000, which he reckoned, this was in 1914, which he reckoned was about half of what he had spent since he bought that place in 1879, refurbished it, repaired it, restored it, and filled it up with furniture. Well, Congress could never wrap their arms around that $500,000 figure, and the matter was dropped during World War I. Now, the other thing I have to tell you about the campaign to take Monticello from Jefferson Levy was that it was tinged with anti-Semitism, sorry to say. Now, neither Mrs. Littleton nor her supporters ever uttered an overt anti-Semitic statement. But the message, they used code words that everybody knew. In their literature, they referred to the Levys as aliens or outsiders, as in outside. Meanwhile, Jefferson Levy is now a sixth-generation American. He couldn't have been more outside. And there was more insider. There was one magazine article that got published, written by one of Mrs. Littleton's allies, where they completely made up a story about how Uriah Levy stole Monticello. Supposedly he was on a coach coming from New York to look at Monticello. Just by coincidence, sitting next to him was a man who the Randolphs had hired to buy the place for them. He found out, got the guy drunk, and bought it out from under him the next day. It did not happen. And worse, there was dialogue in this magazine article, and they had Uriah Levy speaking in this like Shylocky Yiddish accent, which he was born in Philadelphia, So unhappily, that's part of the story. So Jefferson Levy, World War I comes. After the war, he was this boom and bust stock speculator. He went bust. He put Monticello on the market. And he hired a realtor in Washington, D.C. who specialized in Virginia estates. And the sales brochure for Monticello is down there in the research department. I held it in my hands. It's really cool. It's got a wood block of Monticello on the front. You open it up, and there's all these testaments to what a great place it is, from Teddy Roosevelt, from the Marquis de Lafayette, who paid a famous visit there. And the next page, it says, this can be yours for $500,000. So it did not sell right away. This was 1919. Two nonprofit groups formed to try to buy it. Didn't work. But finally, in 1923, the nonprofit Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation was formed with the express purpose of buying Monticello from Jefferson Levy. They negotiated. They met his price. They got a mortgage on it. And I'll read to you a quote from somebody who was at the closing table when they signed the deal. He said the cash and the bonds and mortgage were delivered to Levy, and Levy signed the deed conveying full title to the property and all belongings to the foundation. This was a very emotional scene, and he burst out crying. He said that he never dreamt that he would ever part with the property. 3 months later, on March 6, 1924, at his home on East 37th Street in New York City, Jefferson Levy died of heart disease 5 weeks short of his 72nd birthday. The foundation still owns Monticello. They changed their name about 10 years ago to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. They've done a fantastic job. I think you know, they've reacquired acreage. They have over 3,000 acres now. And they recognize the stewardship of Uriah Levy and Jefferson Levy in saving that place. So the last thing I'll say to you is that this man, Jefferson Levy, was not a shy and retiring type. He liked to compare himself to Thomas Jefferson, whom he was named after. He was a tall man like Jefferson was. He once gave a dinner at Monticello, 7-course dinner where each course recipe came from Jefferson's recipe book. Every 4th of July, he would make it a point to be at Monticello. He would have a big Independence Day party, the band and music and fireworks. He would invite the people from Charlottesville to come up to the mountain, and he would end the evening by coming out on the lawn and reading the Declaration of Independence from Thomas Jefferson's music stand. And the last way that Jefferson Levy emulated Thomas Jefferson was that when Jefferson Levy died, he was over $2 million in debt. Thank you very much, everybody. We have time for questions. I'd be happy to answer questions. Yes, ma'am. Yes, the question is, how did Uriah Levy's mother, Rachel Levy, get there? Yeah, so she is buried on the grounds of Monticello along Mulberry Row. And what happened was she was elderly when he bought the place. And when he took over in 1836, she came up there to live with him, with her son. And what happened was she died I can't remember exactly when it was, but soon thereafter. He was out on a ship. And what happens when Jewish people die? You got to put them in the ground in 24 hours. So that's why she's buried there. Oh, why isn't she buried in the Palace? You know what? That did not convey. The graveyard where Thomas Jefferson and his family are buried never conveyed. It's owned by the descendants. Sure. Good question. Yes, sir, in front. Yes. Right. That's a good question. Is it pronounced Monticello or Monticello? Well, look, if we only had tape recordings of Thomas Jefferson, we would know the answer. But we do know that Jefferson spoke Italian, and Monticello means little hill or hillock in Italian. So we're pretty certain that he did pronounce it Monticello. Now, I thought you were going to ask me about the Levy and the Levy thing. Okay, so I grew up in New Jersey. Jeff Levy was a good friend. Everybody was Levy. So, when I went down to, by the way, this book came from a magazine article that I wrote for Preservation Magazine, the one that's published by the National Trust. So when I first went down there, my wife, Jan, she was with me. We went to the research department at Monticello, and I said, can I see your files on Uriah Levy? And she said, the woman there, very nice, yeah, okay, I'll get you the Uriah Levy files. I thought, okay. So I went through them and I finished. And I said, well, can you bring me the files on Jefferson Levy? And she said, oh, okay, the Jefferson Levy files are right over here. And I thought, okay. And I thought it might have been a Charlottesville thing, So when I got the book contract, I found out that one of the descendants was very, very interested and had a lot of information. And I went up to see Harley Lewis, who lives up in Chautauqua, New York. And she was as kind as could be. We're still friends. This was 15 years ago. And she started talking about Jefferson Levy, who was her great uncle, and said, Levy. And I said, finally, what? Levy? What? And she said, yeah, that's the way they pronounced it. So that was from the family. And then when I got into doing the research on the book, I found 2 primary source documents in which confirmed it. One was when Uriah Levy bought Monticello, there was a little article in the Richmond paper, and it said, U.S. Navy Lieutenant Uriah Levy purchases Monticello. And after his name, it said in parentheses, Leh-Vee, Levy. And then Jefferson Levy, remember, not a shy and retiring guy. The first day he was in Congress, the clerk called the roll and said, Jefferson Levy of New York. And he marched up to the clerk and said, my name is pronounced Levy, and that's the way you're going to do it. And it got in the New York Times. So it made me feel good that, and so I like to spread the word that they pronounced it Levy. And I'll just tell you one other anecdote. A couple years ago, so there's also a Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. It's the fourth oldest congregation, I think. And they dedicated a statue to Uriah Levy up there. It's there, and you should see it. It's kind of cool. And they asked me to come and speak at the dedication ceremony. I get up there, and there were like 200 people. They had about 12 speakers. I can only talk for a couple. Harley Lewis was there. Her two of her grandchildren were there with her. And so I get up there. Oh, and I'm like about the eighth speaker, and they're all talking about Uriah Levy and Uriah Levy this and Uriah Levy that. I go, oh no. So the first thing I said when I got up in front of everybody was, I'm sorry to tell you, but you've been pronouncing his name wrong, and it's Levy. And they all went, whoa, but you know, that's the way. I think I did it a little more decorously than that. Yes, sir. I wish it were. The question is, what brought Monticello to recognize the levies? Well, it dates back to 1984. Before 1984, there was a little plaque that said something to the effect of, Uriah Levy purchased Monticello for $2,700 in 1836, and his nephew sold it for $500,000 in 1923. Well, that's long gone. But in 1984, a new president took over the foundation. His name is Dan Jordan, Jordan. He was a history professor at VCU, a Jefferson scholar at the University of Virginia. He was the first historian to lead that place. And almost the first thing he did was he refurbished Rachel Levy's grave, took the offending sign away, put up new signage, and they had a rededication ceremony where the president of the World Jewish Congress, Edgar Bronfman, came and spoke, and the rabbi from Norfolk and family descendants. So from that point on, 84, things got better and better and better. And Dan's retired, but Leslie Bowman, who runs the place now, and Susan Stein, who's the curator, she started there in 85. They are great on the levies. The new visitor center, I mean, I call it new. It opened about 07 or 08, something like that. They have a great exhibit on the levies in there. And the guides know the story, although if you take the regular tour, they don't have much time. They have like 20 minutes to a half hour, and they don't get to tell the whole story of Jefferson, much less the levies. But sometimes they get to it, but if you ask, they know the answer. Yes? Really? Well, it looks really good now. Yeah, yeah. What year are you thinking about? Gosh, yeah. Yeah, I have a picture in the book, which was taken in 2000, and it looked good then. You know, there construction going on along Mulberry Road. That might have had some, no? Hmm. Oh, gosh. Yeah, sure. Well, it isn't now, so yeah, yes. Were the levies practicing Jews? Yeah, that's a good question. No. I mean, they were proud Jews for sure, especially Uriah Levy. I didn't mention one other thing that happened to him was he got riffed out of the Navy. You know what a riff is. He took it personally, as he tended to do. And so he fought the riff. And he actually, this is the one, you know, the letters that Uriah Levy wrote mostly had to do with business. He rarely mentioned Monticello or his history, but in this, it wasn't a trial, but it was a hearing. It was here in Washington at the Navy Yard. And of course, he hired a top lawyer who was the former Secretary of the Navy, and he defended himself, and he gave a long argument in favor of, arguing for himself that's in the archives. And he talks about being a proud Jew and how one of the reasons that this country was so great was because of religious freedom and so on. So we do know that they were members of congregations, but we don't really think that they were active, including Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, because they're from Philadelphia, including Washington Hebrew here. There was a tie with Jefferson Levy or Uriah Levy. Now, we do know that Jefferson Levy's brother, Louis Napoleon, L. Napoleon Levy, he was president of the congregation at Shirth Israel in New York, which is the oldest Hebrew congregation in the country. The great Sephardic temple on East 70th Street. Not the original building, of course, but they go back. They had their 350th like 5 years ago. So yeah, it just, we can't establish the fact. Someone wrote an article years ago, when Monticello had a mezuzah, but that was like symbolic. Someone actually asked me, where was it? And I said, I don't think there was one. Yeah. Yes. Oh, right, right. Yeah, well, two good point about this during the Civil War. For one thing, even though 60% of the Civil War was fought in Virginia, there was no fighting in Charlottesville, thank God. So Monticello did not get any more ruined than it had been over those years when people were taking the chippings out and so on. And it was a transportation hub because of the railroad. So Union troops are coming through and Confederate troops, and they bivouacked up there and convalesced and so on. Now, but Monticello was confiscated by the Confederate States of America under the Sequestration Act because it was owned by a Northerner. And of course, Uriah Levy, the pugnacious Commodore, did not take that lying down, so he hired a lawyer. And they held that confiscation up even until after he died. He died in 62. And they finally took over, the Confederate States of America took over the place in the fall of 64, and they auctioned it off. And a man named Benjamin Franklin Ficklin, a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Navy, the Army, but he also was a blockade runner. He bought it for $80,000 in Confederate money. And he lived there, or his family did, until the war was over. And then in March of 35, it went back to the Levy family. Was that your question? Yeah, yeah. So we're lucky in a way that the place did not get no battle damage or anything like that. And so that's one more owner of Monticello. Yeah, yeah. You should definitely go check out the Levy Chapel next time you're in Annapolis. I have books here if people want them. Thanks very much.